rally round the flag, boys will rally once again, shouting the battle cry of free.
Greetings, juniors. Little fun music for you there from the Schaefer Lair. This is your weekly lockdown quarantine talk. And as usual, because it's the Civil War, I'm in my authentic Union kepi. The bumper music you heard there was a pro-Union song, Battle Cry Freedom. And this week, talking about three actually very important events. Well, all very important events. 5 actually. This week we're going to be talking about first, when we look at the readings over here, you'll see that the first reading talks about the Vicksburg campaign, Vicksburg, Mississippi, which sits astride the Mississippi River. It was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi, vital to keeping the Confederacy together. The Mississippi River cuts the Confederacy in two, isolating the western part of the Confederacy, which is Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. And this is why it's part of the Anaconda strategy that we learned about. Lincoln absolutely wanted the Mississippi firmly in Union hands to divide the Confederacy, keep the western part of the Confederacy from aiding the eastern part. And U.S. Grant is going to lead the Vicksburg campaign. U.S. Grant, kind of a controversial character early in the Civil War. You read in your supplemental readings a fun story about the U.S. in his name. What did it stand for? People thought it stood for unconditional surrender because of the demands he sends into Fort Donelson, which surrenders to him in the winter of 1862. Actually, the U.S. really doesn't stand for anything. His first name was not Ulysses, and the S does not stand for Simpson. His birth name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. But a careless clerk at the U.S. Military Academy recorded it as Ulysses S. And Grant, being so shy, he didn't want to correct the man. The S really stands for nothing. But U.S. Grant just always went along with it. Here he's going to lead the campaign that's going to topple Vicksburg in the summer of 1863. Great video on there that you can watch from Terry Winchell, a former colleague of mine. Great guy. Fun 5-minute quick lecture on the importance of Vicksburg. Then we're going to talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, or at least the Gettysburg campaign. Gettysburg was not just a 3-day battle, but a 3-month campaign where Robert E. Lee invades the Union again. This time, though, he completely sidesteps Maryland. Maryland had let him down badly the summer before. He's going to drive directly into the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which had been untouched by the war up to that point. And his motivations are largely the same, except this time he wants to relieve some of the pressure on Vicksburg. There had been talk about taking part of his army and sending it west to defend that city. Lee was against splitting up his army. He felt that his army, by this point in the Civil War, Lee really believed that his army was invincible. He had taken the best the Union had to offer, and he had defeated them almost every single time. And this belief in his invincibility is going to be his downfall. So he invades the Union again. He had just won the Battle of Chancellorsville. Remember how we talked about Lee and the initiative. And he had the initiative after Chancellorsville in May of 1863. He's going to push north, drive his army into Pennsylvania. His target is the capital of Pennsylvania, which is Harrisburg, which sits astride the Susquehanna River. The Union is going to do something very odd, is they're going to change commanders in the middle of the campaign. Hooker's going to resign. Lincoln is forced to give the command. He doesn't even ask. He gives the command to General George Meade. Meade then must basically learn on the fly. He had never commanded an army before. He had, at the time of his promotion, he had been in command of the 5th Army Corps. Refer back to your Army organizational chart to see what I mean by corps. And Meade is going to follow Lee into Pennsylvania. And those of you who have had my M Week class on the Battle of Gettysburg, this should be old hat to you. But I don't really have time to go into the details of the battle. I could spend 4 of these videos, 10 minutes each, on just the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. But Meade pursues Lee into Pennsylvania. They collide at the crossroads village of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. Lee maintains his aggressive stance. He attacks Meade repeatedly on those 3 days, and his army is defeated. On July 3rd, he launches a full-scale frontal assault against the center of Meade's line. This is known as Pickett's Charge. And the Union repulse Lee's attack. And Lee, again, loses over a quarter of his troops. Losses that the Confederates just couldn't sustain. The Battle of Gettysburg, guys, is by far the bloodiest battle of the war. It's a 3-day battle, over 50,000 casualties from both sides. And also on your reading list then, Lincoln has to make sense of it all. So Lincoln is going to travel to Gettysburg in November of 1863. There's a great article over here by the philosopher and historian Gary Wills about what Lincoln did at Gettysburg. This is where ordinarily I would have you memorize the Gettysburg Address, but that's difficult in our current educational program. So I invite you to read the Gettysburg Address, but also read Gary Wills' interpretation of it. It's a turning point in American history. Not only does Lincoln take the opportunity to change the focus of the war, but he uses it to change the focus of the American presidency as well. So Gary Wills' article is very good. Then we're going to go on, and you're going to read a little bit about women in the Civil War. How did women get involved? In fact, there's a video I have for you about that. And after the Battle of Gettysburg, the war is going to take a shift. Some people look at Gettysburg as the turning point because following Gettysburg, the Confederate war strategy completely changes. Following Gettysburg, the Confederacy is going to go on the defensive. Robert E. Lee is going to go on the defensive, and he's going to remain there the rest of the war. U.S. Grant is brought east. He's promoted to lieutenant general. This is following the fall of Vicksburg, and notice July 4th, 1863 was a great Independence Day celebration because not only had Lee been defeated at Gettysburg, but Vicksburg had surrendered on July 4th. The Confederate commander at Vicksburg was actually born in the Union. His name was John C. Pemberton, and he told his subordinates that we could get better terms on the 4th of July than any other day of the year. So that's why he surrendered on that day. U.S. Grant, of course, becomes the great hero. He's brought east. He's promoted to lieutenant general, 3-star general, the first man to hold that rank since George Washington. He's promoted to command of all volunteer troops, which at that time in early 1864, there were close to 3 million men under arms. The United States had the largest army on earth at the time, and U.S. Grant commanded it all. He attaches himself to the Army of the Potomac, Meade's army, and he's going to follow Meade as he doggedly pursues Lee into Virginia. And sometimes people call this Grant versus Lee. Grant was providing the strategic oversight. Meade, the commander of the army, was carrying out the tactical movements, that kind of thing. Lee and Grant, two very different men. Grant was not kind of the classic military form. He hated pomp. He hated circumstance. He did not like all the military dress. He wore a private's jacket. His staff had to sew the stars onto his shoulders. Grant didn't like music. He said he knew two songs. One was Yankee Doodle and the other one wasn't. Whereas Robert E. Lee loved life in the military. He loved the uniforms, the pageantry of it all. Two very different men. Grant was obscure before the war. In fact, Grant had been a failure at life pretty much. Soldiering was the only thing he ever really did well. Whereas Lee came from one of the most prominent families in Virginia. Lee's father was George Washington's best friend. So that tells you a little bit about Lee's family. So these two men are going to square off in the summer of 1864. You can read about some of that in your supplemental readings. So all of this is for us this week. And then next week we will wrap up the war. The final thing over here on your supplemental readings talks about Lincoln's reelection. In the summer of 1864, Lincoln was not feeling very positive about his reelection chances. There's a famous memo that you can read from August of 1864. Imagine you worked in the Lincoln White House and you received a memo on a hot August day from your boss saying that the likelihood of your reelection was slim, probably going to lose, which meant that you would have to win the Civil War between the election and the next inauguration, because the guy who had just defeated you had won the election, pretty much promising to end the war. The guy who runs against Lincoln, believe it or not, is McClellan. The Democrats, feeling rather saucy, nominated George McClellan in a kind of a shrewd move because they knew where most of the voting age men were in the country at that time. They were in the Army. Remember, we're still talking about a time here, guys, where it's only white men over the age of 21, and a big chunk of them are in the military. McClellan had been a very popular commander, and many of the troops still loved him because of everything he did for them, made them feel like soldiers, etc. But McClellan did want to end hostilities, and the soldiers in the Army didn't want that because they wanted to see the war finished. They did not want to make all the sacrifices for nothing. Many of the men had lost relatives or best friends in the service. They had committed themselves completely to the cause. They wanted to see the thing through. And the only way to see the thing through was to vote for Lincoln. And that's what they do. Lincoln wins 80% of the military vote. So there's something for you to read over here about the election of 1864, a vital election in our history because it means that we can win the Civil War. Next week, we'll get to the end of the Civil War. We'll talk about the assassination of Lincoln and also the early steps toward Reconstruction, and that will be your course. Remember to keep up with the supplemental reading. I see I'm getting lots of emails today. That's good. Keep them coming. Office hours tomorrow. Please come to office hours. I know that some of you feel that it's not necessary. I answer any and all questions you might have about assignments, about readings, whatever. I get a couple of people each week. I'd like to have a full Zoom office hour at least once before our school year is over. And be safe out there, history folks. Be erudite. I'll leave you with a little more battle cry freedom Enjoy. Farewell from the Schaefer Lair.